Welcome. Dear. There was once, hidden in the farthest corner of a library that no one remembered, a single, quiet book bound in worn blue cloth and golden thread, resting on a forgotten shelf behind dusty stacks and under cobwebs spun like ancient lace. This book had no title on its spine, no library markings, and no one could quite recall when or how it had arrived. But if you ask the oldest librarian, an elderly man with silver glasses, a woolen vest, and fingers stained by time and ink, he might smile gently and whisper that the book had always been there, waiting, as if it had grown from the shelf itself like a soft-barked tree. It was known in old ledgers and whispered legends as the bedtime book that time forgot, a book that did not tell just one story but 100,000 dreams, stitched together by candlelight, by the breath of sleeping cities, and the sighs of wanderers who once lived in the in-between hours of dusk and dawn. The story begins not with a hero, but with a whisper. For one evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon and the library lights flickered on like sleepy fireflies, a young girl named Clara wandered past the arch of the northern wing, drawn by a curious coolness in the air, a scent like lavender and parchment, a feeling as though a lullaby had been sung just moments before she arrived. She wore a cardigan with mismatched buttons and carried a notebook filled with half-written dreams and sketches of places she'd never been, and when she reached the forgotten shelf, her fingers hesitated over every book but one, the one with no title, no author, only a soft warmth in its binding as if it had waited for her touch for centuries. When Clara opened it, the air shifted gently, and the pages turned by themselves with a rustle like leaves in early autumn, revealing ink that glimmered faintly with starlight, words written in many hands and many tongues, all whispering their own version of the same gentle tale, the tale of places that lived in memory alone, of clocks that ticked backwards at midnight, of towns where dreams were traded at market stalls and lullabies were baked into loaves of warm bread. The book told her of an ancient mountain village where the wind sang lullabies in hollow flutes carved into the stone cliffs, and of a small wooden house perched above the clouds where a lonely watchmaker stitched silver threads into the night sky so the stars would never drift too far. It whispered of a city under the sea where jellyfish glowed with forgotten poems, and where sleeping children heard echoes of distant lullabies carried by the tides. The longer Clara read, the deeper she drifted into the world of the book. Not asleep, but not quite awake either, her thoughts soft and unhurried, her breath slowing like the pages themselves, which now turned not with her hands, but with the rhythm of her heart. She read of an ancient orchard where trees grew books instead of fruit, and the wind carried stories through their leaves, and of a grandmother who embroidered bedtime tales into silk handkerchiefs for her grandchildren to carry in their dreams. Each story folded gently into the next like a blanket being tucked around the night, until Clara could no longer tell whether she was reading the book or the book was reading her, and the library itself seemed to hum softly, the shelves swaying, as if in a slow waltz with time, the lights dimming to the soft blue of dusk, and outside the tall windows, stars began to peek one by one through a velvety sky. In the world of the book, Clara wandered through a lantern festival that never ended, where people traded stories like glowing paper charms, each floating gently into the sky, and she followed a rabbit made of ink and moonlight through quiet gardens, into rooms where nothing had changed for 1,000 years, where the scent of tea and old parchment lingered like a memory. She watched snow fall in a desert where night bloomed like a flower and listened to music played on instruments, shaped like hourglasses, their songs stretching time until morning felt 100 years away. Hours may have passed or perhaps none at all, for in the presence of the book, time grew sleepy, like a child rocked gently in a cradle of ink and dreams, and Clara, curled up beside the shelves with the book resting against her chest, finally let her eyes drift closed, the story still unfolding in her thoughts, whispering promises of gentle worlds and quiet adventures that would continue long after the last page. And though the librarians searched for her the next morning, they never quite found Clara, not truly, for she had become part of the book itself. her story nestled among the thousands within its pages, waiting for the next curious soul who wandered past the forgotten shelf and reached for the book with no title. The book that remembered dreams even when time forgot. The bedtime book that asked nothing more than for you to sit quietly, listen with your heart, and let the night tell its gentle tale. Clara drifted deeper into the story without ever turning a page, as if the book had grown roots in her hands and the words were rising like mist through her thoughts, weaving softly around her like a woolen shawl warmed by candlelight. And as the glow of the library dimmed into a kind of timeless twilight, she found herself no longer seated among the shelves, but quietly walking through a gentle forest of whispering paper trees, their trunks pale and fluttering, their leaves inked, with forgotten lullabies and lullings of languages no longer spoken aloud. Overhead, the sky was not quite night and not quite day, a silvery in-between hue that glowed with a softness only dreams can hold, and with each step, Clara felt the presence of stories unspooling beneath her feet, tiny footprints left behind, on winding paths of parchment and thread. She came upon a bridge made of books, arched over a calm, moonlit stream, where reflections showed not your face, but your favorite memory. And she paused there for a while, listening to the sound of 1,000 unread poems drifting by like leaves carried by time. And when she looked down, the water showed her not a single image, but pages from her own notebook, the ones she hadn't finished, the half-drawn constellations, the scribbled tales about clock towers and faraway trains, the names she gave to cities that didn't exist on any map. And for the first time, she felt as though someone, somewhere, had read her quietest thoughts and tucked them gently into the folds of the book. She followed the path beyond the bridge until she reached a low meadow where lanterns grew on tall stems like glowing blossoms, their golden petals flickering in the still air, and seated among them were other readers, silent figures made of shadow and stardust, wrapped in patchwork robes stitched from the margins of beloved pages, each one gently turning a book in their lap as the wind rustled their stories with a sound like distant lullabies. Clara was not afraid of them, for they seemed to exist only in the spaces between dreams, and as one turned toward her, their face unreadable but kind, they offered her a lantern. Not with their hand, but by simply letting it float toward her, warm and light, tethered by a ribbon of quiet memory. And when Clara touched it, she saw within its flame a glimpse of the next tale, a town where clocks no longer ticked but breathed softly, exhaling hours like feathers, where bakeries opened only at midnight, to serve moon-shaped pastries and whispering bread, where the stars were not overhead but hidden in cellars and brought out one by one each evening to light the cobbled streets. The lantern bobbed gently, pulling Clara onward, guiding her through a field where bedtime stories bloomed like wildflowers, their petals unfolding in slow motion as she passed, each releasing a scent like rain on paper and the hum of a remembered melody. And as she moved further through the dreamscape the book had become, Clara began to understand, without ever being told, that the bedtime book was not just a collection of stories, but a map for the dreamers of the world, a living, breathing library that chose its readers with care, inviting only those who still listened closely to the quiet, who still believed that wonder was hidden in the corners of old buildings and behind locked drawers and in the pause before sleep. Eventually, she reached a tall hill where a single tree grew, a tree with bark like book leather and branches of ribboned ink, its leaves delicate as vellum, and at its roots lay a shallow pool of silver light where the book rested once more, this time closed but glowing faintly, its cover warm to the touch and humming like a sleeping cat. Clara sat beside it, the lantern now gently hovering over her shoulder, and she rested her hands on her knees, not needing to read any more, for the story had become her own heartbeat, slow and steady and full of quiet magic, and as the stars turned slowly above like gentle dancers, the meadow breathed with her, cradling her in a night that had no end, and in that hush between one page and the next, Clara knew. The story wasn't finished. It was only resting, waiting for the next dream to bloom. The tree on the hill stood silently as time curled softly around its roots, and Clara, nestled beside the glowing book, found herself slowly rising, not with her feet, but with her thoughts, as though the wind had gently lifted her from the ground and carried her into a place even deeper within the story, a place not written in words but shaped by the feelings between them, the hush before a child's yawn, the warmth of a favorite blanket, the quiet promise of a night that asks nothing at all. She floated through a sky of parchment clouds and ink-lined winds, her lantern bobbing faithfully beside her like a star that had chosen her alone to follow, and below her the world of the book unfolded with dreamlike calm. Great cities of silence, where towers rang only with memory, forests where every tree hummed with songs written centuries ago, and long-forgotten train stations where the tracks curved gently into mist, waiting for trains that ran only at midnight and only for those who believed in destinations they couldn't name. She passed over rooftops where sleeping cats guarded piles of unread poems, and through markets where time itself was sold in tiny jars, some filled with golden mornings, some with rainy afternoons, and some with the scent of books opened after years of waiting. Eventually she was lowered again, gently and without sound, into a hidden courtyard surrounded by ivy-covered walls and soft orange lanterns that blinked like fireflies, and in the center sat a circle of chairs, some empty, some occupied by shadows who looked up only briefly to nod at her arrival before returning to their reading, their silence full of welcome. She sat in one, and the book opened in her lap again, not because she touched it, but because the story knew she was ready. And it revealed to her a story within the story, one about a boy named Theo who once found the same book in a different time in a library that no longer existed, a boy who followed a trail of glowing marbles through the back alleys of a sleeping city, led by a mechanical owl with feathered gears and golden eyes, who reached a rooftop observatory where a telescope didn't show stars but scenes from forgotten dreams, a birthday that never happened, a garden that bloomed only in a grandmother's memory, a kite that never landed. And Clara understood then that the book was not only about stories remembered, but also those nearly lost, the quiet hopes, the whispered wishes, the tiny worlds built in the hearts of children who never had the chance to share them aloud. She turned the page and the courtyard shimmered, and suddenly she was standing in a long corridor lined with glowing doors, each marked not by numbers or names, but by moments. A first snowfall, a lullaby hummed beside a cradle, the creak of an old staircase at bedtime, and as she walked past each one, some would open just a crack, letting out a sigh of memory, and others remained closed, not coldly, but patiently, as if waiting for someone else's story to be ready. Finally, she stopped at one that pulsed softly like a heartbeat, and when she stepped through, she found herself in a room filled with clocks, tall ones, tiny ones, some with no hands, some ticking forward, some backward, and one that chimed, not with bells, but with a soft hush like turning a page, and she saw, seated at a wide desk, the old librarian she once thought was just a man behind a desk, now revealed to be something older, gentler, quieter than time itself, his eyes twinkling. Behind silver glasses, his vest stitched from scraps of stories, and his smile the kind that knew things before they happened. He looked at Clara and simply said, "You've found the story, and now it's found you." And with a slow nod he handed her a pen, not just any pen, but one filled with ink that shimmered like moonlight on still water, and he pointed to an empty page in the book, which had gently opened once more. Without hesitation, Clara sat and began to write. Not hurriedly, not perfectly, but truthfully, dreamily, letting each word fall like a raindrop onto soft soil, growing a story of her own into the garden of the book, and, as she wrote, the other. Clocks quieted, the room glowed warmer, and the pen never ran dry because the bedtime book that time forgot had never needed to end. It only needed someone to remember to keep dreaming. Clara did not know how long she had been writing. For in the world of the bedtime book, hours folded softly into one another like blankets stacked in a quiet room, and the passage of time felt less like something measured and more like something remembered. And as her pen glided across the last page, the ink now glowing faintly with every word, she noticed that the book itself no longer hummed beneath her hands. It breathed, slowly, peacefully, like a living story resting between dreams. The old librarian stood behind her now, not watching but simply present, like the hush of dawn before birdsong begins. And when she looked up at him, he smiled with eyes that seemed to contain the hush of every library and the memory of every bedtime, and he gently closed the book, its cover now warm and pulsing softly as if it held a new heartbeat within it. Hers. He did not speak, and he didn't need to, because Clara understood without words that her story was now part of the book, woven gently into the tapestry of dreams that stretched back through ages, and that whenever another curious soul wandered past a quiet shelf or followed a glimmer of lantern light in the corner of an old library, they might find her story nestled gently between the leaves like a pressed flower from a long-forgotten summer. And so she rose from her chair, which dissolved like mist behind her, and followed the quiet path the lantern showed her one last time. This time not floating above, but gently winding downward, through pages that folded themselves into bridges, into staircases, into gentle streams of golden dust that shimmered in the air like laughter remembered in a dream. She passed once more through the fields of lantern blooms, where the silent readers lifted their heads to nod farewell, not in sadness, but in the calm assurance that stories never truly leave. They simply rest until they are read again, and she stepped through a doorway made of lullabies and low candlelight and found herself once more in the stillness of the forgotten library wing. The lantern dimming now, the book closed before her, quiet and content on the shelf where she had first found it. The morning sun had just begun to stretch its golden fingers through the tall windows, casting gentle patterns on the wood floor, and Clara, wrapped in the soft glow of dreams fulfilled, stood still for a moment before turning away. Not because she was leaving something behind, but because now she carried it with her, gently and forever, a story written not in ink alone, but in wonder, and silence, and sleep. And so it is said that the bedtime book that time forgot still waits, hidden among the hush of ancient pages, listening for the breath of a dreamer, a reader, a wanderer who will find it not by searching, but by trusting in the quiet paths between thoughts, in the flutter of paper wings and the stillness between clock ticks, and when they do, they too will become part of its gentle world, held softly in its endless night, where no story truly ends, and every dream is simply waiting to be read once more.